Hi, welcome to a quick tutorial on using clusters in Assembly Planner. The Clusters tool is an enhancement to the Precedence Graph feature that we currently have in Assembly Planner. It offers an easier method to define the build sequence without having to know the order of each and every activity being performed on a product. So let's consider a quick example. So let's say we have 120 activities in automobile manufacturing assembly. And let's say these are a combination of 30 activities each for installing doors, seats, center console, and instrumentation panel. So without defining clusters, let's look at what the precedence graph would look like for this example. So we have all the 120 activities listed here in the graph in no particular sequence defined yet. For this example, I have defined my activities in the sequence I wanted. So we can simply use the default precedence tool that we already have in Assembly Planner. So here we have the default precedence defined for our 120 activities. As we can see, having 120 activities displayed at the same time in the graph, it is challenging for someone to understand which activities belong to what operation, and if someone has to resequence these activities, they will have to find the actual activities they want to resequence and then change the predecessor and successor after that. Well, this was a simple scenario. Having to find the activities amongst hundreds and or even some cases thousands of activities could be really difficult. Also, we can't really understand the whole picture from just looking at this graph, whether which set of activities relate to installing doors, installing seats, and installing center console. So let's look at the same example with using clusters. So I'm going to remove the default precedence that I had for this current example. So the first and easiest way of defining cluster is to use the cluster ID column in the sheet view of the precedence graph control. So to create a cluster, you could simply start typing a cluster ID name in the cluster ID column. So for the first cluster, I'm going to name it door installation. And once you save this, a cluster with the ID of door installation has been created. And moving forward, you can simply click on this drop down to choose from the existing list of clusters. So the next way of creating a cluster is to just hold shift and select the next set of activities and use the right click menu option called add cluster. This would open a new window where the selected activities would be listed here, and you can simply create a cluster by giving it an ID here. So I'm going to name this seats installation. And you can add more activities to the list or remove some activities from here by using these buttons. I'll revisit them later. So as you can see, I have two clusters defined. For the first 30 activities, it's door installation, and for the next set of activities, it's seats installation. So now let's look at creation of clusters from the clusters view. So here in the clusters view, you have the list of all the clusters that you have created from either of the sheet or graph views. So here you can also create a new cluster, and I'm going to create a new cluster for our next set of 30 activities and name it center console installation. Now to add activities to this cluster, you can simply right click on this row and you'll be presented with the similar form that we saw while creating the cluster. Now let's add activities. So by default, the search criteria in the advanced search form would be filled with the routing details of the routing that you are currently in. So on simply clicking search, you'd be listed with all the activities that are there in the current routing. So I'm going to go ahead and add the relevant activities to this cluster. So I have modified my search to bring up the relevant activities. So once you have the selection ready, you can just click add page here and you brought the activities into this cluster. Now click OK, and when you hit save, we have created 3 clusters. Now let's look at the graph. So I'm going to show you the last and the graphical way of creating clusters, which is using the right click menu here in the graph and using the add new cluster button. I'm going to create the last cluster here for the instrument panel. And I'm going to show you how it's easy to just simply drag and drop nodes into clusters. Now I have selected all the activities that are not defined within the cluster, and I'm going to simply hold shift and move it in the last cluster that I've created. So now when we zoom out, all we have is the 4 clusters that we have defined. To define precedence between these clusters, all you have to do is link these clusters like this. Now to look at what is inside these clusters, you can simply right click and click on expand cluster. So this will bring up an exploded view of all the activities that's inside a cluster. You can also collapse and expand all the clusters in the view by choosing the right click menu items, expand all clusters and collapse all clusters. Now if we have to resequence any of these activities, then all we have to do is change the links between the clusters. So now let's say we have decided to do seats installation right after doors installation before moving on to the rest. Now all you have to do is change the links between these clusters instead of having to find the set of activities that belongs to these groups and changing each and every links between them. And another advantage of using clusters is the ability to have clusters inside clusters. So now let's say we have a capability of doing the instrumentation panel installation and the center console installation parallelly in the same station. So all you have to do here is create a new cluster called and you can simply drag these clusters and hold shift, and once the new cluster highlights you can drop them inside and you can link the last cluster to this one. Now if you expand this cluster and collapse the ones inside it, you'll be able to see that we have the 2 clusters inside the larger cluster. From a precedence standpoint, what this means is that all the activities inside the seats installation cluster should be done before all the activities inside instrumentation panel cluster and also the center console installation cluster. Now I have added two more activities for inspection that's going to be done after the installation. And I do not wish to create clusters for these inspection activities. You can still draw precedence by just linking the cluster to the activity. The color of these links vary depending on what they are in connection with. If there are two activities linked together, the actual link's color will be black, whereas if you had connected a cluster to an activity, then the link's color will be green, and if you had two clusters linked together, the link's color will be blue. When having hundreds of activities and clusters in the view, the color of these links could help us identify what they are in connection with. This was a quick overview of all the main features that's available in clusters in Assembly Planner. For more details on each and every feature that's available here, you can refer to the help manual in the ProPlanner website.